Welcome to the Information Systems for Business podcast. I'm your host, Craig Van Slyke. The main purpose of the podcast is to augment the book Information Systems for Business: An Experiential Approach by Franz Belanger, Craig Van Slyke, and Rob Crossler. The book is published by Prospect Press. Before we get started, I want to give a few disclaimers. The podcast purposely omits many details in order to get to the high points of each chapter. So listening to the podcast is not a substitute for reading the book. Each episode contains my view of the most important points of each chapter. Your professor may have a different view. The podcast is solely my responsibility, so any errors are on me, not my co-authors, your professors, Prospect Press, or my employer. Enough of the disclaimers, let's get to the good stuff. In this episode, we hit the high points of Chapter 3, which is about evaluating information. The focusing story for Chapter 3 tells the tale of Casey Hickox, a volunteer nurse for Doctors Without Borders who suffered some significant consequences as a result of misinformation provided by then New Jersey Governor Chris Christie. The story is a bit detailed, so I'm not going to cover everything here, but you really should read the story as it is a strong cautionary tale about the dangers of inaccurate information. Chapter 3 has two broad purposes. First, it points out the consequences of using poor quality information, and it also gives you some ways to think about and evaluate information quality. As you well know, we face a barrage of information every day. In order to benefit from this information, we need to understand how to use it effectively, which includes being able to evaluate the information's usefulness. Unfortunately, in many cases, bad information is worse than no information at all, so it's in your best interest to understand what affects information quality and how to assess information quality. Chapter 3 starts out by making the case for the importance of information quality and of being a smart information consumer. The chapter then briefly discusses information overload, which happens when we face more information than we can effectively process, and also mentions ways to deal with information overload. It's difficult to evaluate information quality if you don't know what information quality is, so the next section of the chapter clues you in on some dimensions of information quality. The chapter wraps up by giving you a framework that you can use to evaluate information. Here are the main points made in Chapter 3. Relying on poor quality information can bring about serious consequences. The huge amount of information available to us makes this problem worse. So, we need to step out of our autopilot mode and critically evaluate information, especially when we're using information for higher impact decisions. This is part of being a smart information consumer. Poor information quality costs organizations billions of dollars a year, so being able to evaluate information is important from a professional standpoint as well. Information evaluation is a systematic determination of the merit and worth of information. Information evaluation skills are important both personally and professionally. Information overload is a very real problem that gets worse as information becomes increasingly available. There are two main strategies for managing information overload. Withdrawal involves disconnecting from sources of information, for example, by not checking email or not looking at your phone. Filtering involves knowing what information we need and what information is worth paying attention to and using. Effective filtering requires good information evaluation skills, which in turn require some understanding of information quality. We can divide the dimensions of information quality into four categories, two of which are covered in the chapter. Intrinsic quality includes dimensions of quality that are important regardless of the context. Contextual quality includes dimensions that may be viewed differently depending upon what you're doing. Intrinsic quality dimensions concern whether the information is accurate, believable, objective, consistent, and understandable. Contextual quality dimensions cover whether the information is relevant, timely, comprehensive, and current. We can translate these into a framework for information evaluation that basically involves determining whether the information is useful and believable. Let's wrap up by reinforcing some of the most important things that you need to keep in mind. You're going to be using information almost constantly in your personal and professional lives. If you're awake, you're probably using information. Using bad information can bring about serious negative consequences. Remember, garbage in, garbage out. If you use bad information to make a decision, you're probably going to end up with a bad decision, unless you're really lucky. So, for important decisions, always carefully evaluate whether the information you use to make the decision is relevant and believable. By the way, if it's not relevant, you really don't need to evaluate its believability. Investing time and effort in building your information evaluation skills will absolutely pay dividends throughout your life. Okay, that's it for this episode. Remember that you still need to read the chapter since the book has much more detail. If I mentioned that yet? Fortunately, we, the co-authors, worked really hard to keep the chapters short and to the point so the reading shouldn't be too bad. Talk to you next time.